Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today we're looking at a bunch of different headphone cables from Koala Audio and also from Gladiator Cables. Specifically what we've got is the high-end Taijitu cable from Koala and Gladiator's upper-end line called the Caesar range of cables. That's different from what I reviewed in the past, which is their Gladiator range of cables. I know that some of you don't believe cables make a difference in sound, and that's fine. I'm going to talk a bit about the ergonomics of these cables first, so you can just watch that bit if that's all you care about. And then I'll move into the sound quality of the cables for those that want to know about that. Because all these cables are made from different sorts of wire with different geometries, I'm going to approach this by talking more about what's good and bad about each of the cables, or maybe not even good and bad, but what the strengths of each cable are, where they're going to work well depending on the headphones you're using, and where they're not so much. And with that in mind, I've tested these cables on the Meze Elites, also on the ZMF Vérité Opens that I've got behind me here, and also briefly on the Dan Clark Audio Expanse as well. So I've got a good sense of how each of these cables perform, what their sonic characteristics are as well. And so let's jump in and start talking about these cables. Stepping through what I've got in front of me here, we've got the Koala Audio Taijitu cable, that's this one, and this retails for $900 US. I'll talk about what it's made of shortly, but I just want to start with the basics, and I should mention that that's for a 4-foot or 1.25 meter cable. Putting this one down. I've then got 3 of the Caesar range cables from Gladiator Cables, starting at the bottom with the pure copper cable. That took me a second to work out which one was which, as you'll see in a second. This is just a simple pure copper litz cable. This is a $95 US cable, and I think this is a 1.4 meter cable, so a little bit longer than the Taijitu, but a lot cheaper. We then go to a combination copper silver cable. That's this one here, and you can see now why I had trouble working out which one was which, because they look almost identical. There's just a little bit of difference in the texture that you can see within the wire because of the silver in here. And this one comes in at $132 US, again for a 1.4 meter cable. And I should mention at this point, all the Gladiator pricing I've converted from euros into US dollars. I'm not sure if that's going to fluctuate with the dollar. I assume it will. The final cable I've got, and it's currently attached to the Meze Elites as my recent testing. And this final cable is a monocrystalline pure silver litz. And what monocrystalline means is just that it's been extracted in such a way that it's a single crystal of silver, if you like, that's been stretched out into a wire. And the idea of that is you're going to have less boundaries along the way, and therefore it should improve the sonic character. I'll talk more about that when we get into the details of the review. But the pure silver litz cable comes in at $180 US, again for that 1.4 meter length. So we've basically got here a $95 cable, a $132 cable, a $180 cable, and then all the way up to a $900 cable. The other cables I've got here on my desk are some of the cables for the Meze Elite. We've got the stock cable that comes with them, and then also the upgrade cable, which is about $500 or $600 US. I haven't got it noted down. I've only really got it here to talk about the ergonomics. And so speaking of ergonomics, let's dive into that. And the first thing I want to say is that all of the Gladiator Caesar cables are the same. And what I mean by that is they're all woven the same way. They've all got the same plugs and splitters and things like that. And what I'd say is that they do come across as a cheaper finished cable. And I don't mean that necessarily as a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with the finish, but when you do compare it to things like the Meze upgrade cable and even the Taijitu cable, you can see where the extra money is going. In the case of both the Gladiator cables and the Koala cable, the Taijitu, both of them are using Reen connectors here. One thing that I did notice on the Gladiator cables was that there was no marker on the mini XLR plugs. That's the connection that I chose for my headphones. There was no marker on these for which was the left and the right channel. I'm not sure if that was just an oversight or if they'd never done that way, but it is something that I found I had to fix myself by using a piece of heat shrink around the right side to give myself a quick and easy way to know which was the left and which was the right channel. I'm guessing that that's something that Antonio is going to fix, Antonio being the person that makes Gladiator cables. But it's those sorts of details that you kind of see as being the reason you're spending less money on it. Or not the reason, but because you're spending less money on it. So you've got connectors that are fine, they're not as premium as something like the Meze upgrade cable, but there's nothing wrong with ring connectors. We then come down to the splitter on these, and it's using the same exact splitter as the cheaper Gladiator range. And on one hand, I don't mind that. I think it's kind of cool and unique, this little Gladiator helmet, but it also doesn't feel quite as premium as something like the Via Blue splitter that's on the Taijitu, or the custom-made splitter that's on the Meze cable. Finally, down the end, I ordered these with 4.4mm plugs, and it's a decent 4.4mm connector, but it's not amazing. It's not as good as some of the quality I've seen on other cables that cost a bit more money. And so it's worth keeping that in mind. When you're spending more money on cables, part of what you might be getting is better wire, but the other thing you might be getting is a more complex weave, for instance, maybe a tighter weave that holds its shape better. Not that there is anything wrong with this weave. It feels completely fine. It's held its shape nicely. It drapes nicely across the desk. It's been a joy to use these cables from that point of view. But if you do look at something like the amazing Meze Audio upgrade cable, which I've got all tangled here, if you look at the weave on this, it's an incredibly tight, what I call a square braid. I don't know what the right term for it is, but it's braided in such a way that the finishing profile is kind of a square feeling cable, and it just looks and feels fantastic. So you do pay more for this kind of a finish than you will from Gladiator, but there's also a vast difference in price, and there's nothing wrong with the Gladiator finish. And so what I'm saying here is it's the difference between a really premium feeling cable like the Meze or the Taijitu, and a more basic but very functional cable from the Gladiators. Now, while I'm talking about the Gladiator cables, I do want to jump in and just mention something. Unfortunately, I've seen some pretty harsh criticism of Antonio and his cables on the internet in different places. I don't want to draw too much attention to it, but I do want to flag the fact that Gladiator Cables is a one-man band. And anytime you're buying cables from a one-man band type situation, a startup like this, it's important to recognize that there might be some issues. It's a small, brand new company with a single person making the cables, and so you kind of need to go in with that in mind. It's the sort of situation where you might find that there are occasionally going to be faulty cables sent out. My understanding is that Antonio's been pretty good at fixing those. The other thing to keep in mind is that as one person, if there's a sudden flurry of orders, then there's going to be delays in shipping. So you need to buy it with that in mind, and if those things are not okay with you, don't buy from there. So I'm actually going to say to you right now, if you are concerned about delays in shipping, possibly getting a faulty cable and having to have it rectified either by sending it back or by getting a new cable sent out, if those sorts of things are going to cause you to get angry and frustrated, just don't buy from Gladiator Cables yet. Give him more time to get more established, get more systems in place, things like that. And a prime example is what I mentioned here with the ring connectors. These are very simple to label with a red marker, and in fact the Koala cable just has a little red sleeve that's part of the ring connector. You might have to buy them with that specifically. So it's a very easy thing to do, and it's a shame that Antonio did miss it on what he sent to me, but it's also the sort of thing where I personally don't care. There's ways that I can quickly and easily fix this for myself so it doesn't cause me frustration and anger. But if that sort of thing would cause you frustration and anger, then you shouldn't buy from Gladiator. You have an opportunity, assuming they sound good, and we'll get to that in a minute, you have an opportunity with a company like this to buy cables that are much cheaper from a more established company. And so it's all about what you're looking for. If you want a bargain price on what is theoretically an excellent cable, then that's where you get the benefit of buying from a small startup like this. But if you don't want the hassles of that, then just steer clear, spend more money on a more established brand with more quality control, more systems in place to handle fluctuations in volume of orders. That's where you should go if those things are important to you. So keep that in mind as I continue to talk here, that that's what you're expecting if you go with the Gladiator option. It's all about the quality of the wire inside and the cheap pricing with Gladiator. Whereas with other cables like say the Taijitu, you might be expecting a bit more because Koala's been around for a bit longer. And so with that said, let me put down the Gladiator cable. Just to finalise what I was saying there, all three of the Gladiator cables use the same weave, the same splitters, the same plugs. The only difference is the colour of the splitter is silver on the silver cable. It's that sort of brass look on the two copper or the copper hybrid cable. And so other than that, they're all identical, which is to say they're solid, they're very comfortable to use, but they don't feel super premium. And so now let's look at the much more premium priced Taijitu cable. From an ergonomics point of view, this one looks and feels great. The way it's been designed means that it's a little bit stiffer than the cables from, say, Gladiator cables or something like the Meze upgrade cable, but it's still a very comfortable cable to use. At 1.25 meters, it feels a tiny bit short for me. I do occasionally wish it was just a little tiny bit longer. I think the 1.4 meter length is better from Gladiator, and you can order this longer, so keep that in mind. I think the shortest 1.25 meter option is just a tiny bit too short. Beyond that, I think the look of the sheathing on the Koala Taijitu is fantastic. There's 2 variations you can choose. I chose the diamond one, I think it's called, and I think it looks great. We've then got the nice colour-coded XLR plug from Neutrik or Neutrik, depending on how you say it. That's there as a nice bit of kind of cosmetic flair rather than the basic black or basic silver plug. In terms of the quality of the actual plug, it's no different, it's just colour, it's cosmetic. I've already mentioned at the other end we've got the Reen connectors. They're just basic connectors, nothing special, but they're a good solid brand. And then finally, the splitter here is absolutely gorgeous. It's a big chunky Via Blue splitter, very high quality look and feel. It has got a flat edge which could catch on the desk, but I think what I've found with it is it's positioned in such a place that it hasn't caused me too much trouble. Sometimes these kind of hard or flat edged cables can catch on the edge of a desk if you're sitting like me listening to your headphones, but I haven't found that with a Koala cable, so maybe the length of the split is different compared to some other cables. It hasn't caused a problem, and that's the main thing. And so ergonomically, I'd say that they're all pretty much on par. I think the Taijitu cable definitely feels like the nicer cable. It feels much more premium. And so if you are looking for a cable purely from an aesthetic and comfort point of view, then the Taijitu is a lovely cable to work with. That said, there's also absolutely nothing wrong with the Gladiators. As I said before, they're softer, they're more supple, they just don't feel and look quite as premium. And so with that in mind, if you're only interested in the ergonomics, this is probably the place to say farewell. But if you do want to know what sonic character I think each of these cables brings, then watch on as we talk about that now. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list. And then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. I'm going to start with the Koala Taijitu here, and the first thing to know about this cable is what it's made of. And Koala cables have made some interesting decisions here. Rather than going with a super duper high purity copper, as many of the premium cables do, where they're talking sort of 6N, 7N, and the N number is for the number of 9s within the purity. So if it's a 4N cable like this one, then it's 99.99% pure. So that means there are going to be some minor impurities in the wire, and the theory behind purity of wire is that it can impact, theoretically, on the ability of the signal to pass easily through the wire without any kind of internal reflections, any loss of signal, anything like that. But in the case of Koala, they've deliberately chosen to go with 4N because they believe the purity is less important than a few other factors. And one of those key facts is that within this wire there are a very few number of strands. Generally speaking, a solid core wire performs better than a stranded wire because you've just got a single conductor for the wire to carry through. And so Koala have tried to split the difference. They've gone with a very small number of strands so that it's a more flexible wire because solid core wires tend to break. So they've used a stranded wire but a very low strand count. So they're trying to get the benefits of a more solid core sound, but with a few strands to make it a more supple cable that's not going to break. Something else that I thought was really interesting about the Taijitu cable is that they've deliberately used different solder at the XLR end to, in this case, the mini XLR end. And the theory behind that is that they've been able to tailor the sound of the cable slightly based on the solder used. Now, some of you might immediately think that that's a load of hogwash, but in my experience, different solders can change the sound. Because the solder is essentially a part of the connection, the signal is going to have to carry through it, and therefore I do believe it can have an impact. There's a lot of high-end audio companies that use different qualities of solder in different levels or tiers of their gear, so it's not uncommon to hear about different solder being used, but I can't say I've ever heard a blend of solders with one at one end and one at the other. That's a new thing to me. And so the long and the short of it is that the Taijitu cable does something very different. And that's the reason that I bought this cable in the first place, was because I was curious to see if the approach that Koala were taking was actually a good solution. And what I mean by that is their focus is much more on the engineering of the cable and much less on the purity of the wire. So in other words, they've focused on the thickness of the wires inside. They've focused on having only those 7 strands instead of, say, 40 plus in most cables. And they've thought more about the geometry, as I said before, the impedance, inductance, etc., rather than having a super pure copper. And so I was fascinated to see which one I found to be the most important and whether their marketing claims that what they've focused on is the most important, whether that's true or not. The final thing I'm going to mention before I put this one down is that it's not a litz cable in here. They are just regular stranded wires. And for those of you that don't know, litz cables are where each individual strand of copper or whatever the conductor is coated in its very own insulation. So none of the signal can cross between the different strands. Whereas in a cable like this one, the signal can and does cross between the different strands as it travels through the wire. Whether or not that pays off in different sound, we're going to see soon. And in fact, I think we might jump straight in now to talking about the sound of the Koala cable before we get to the Gladiators. And the first thing that I tested was I took the stock Meze cable, which is here. It's a lovely cable. It's a really nice stock cable for a headphone, but I've always felt like it held back both the Meze Elites and also the Meze Empyreans. So I started with this, had a bit of a listen, and then moved over to the Taijitu. And while listening to It Last by Joni Mitchell, what I found was that the sound from the Taijitu cable compared to this stock cable was smoother than the stock cable, but it was also more insightful. It was giving me more detail within the music. It was like the Taijitu cable was just a bit more transparent, able to give me more insight, more connection to the details within the music when compared to the stock cable, and yet it was still very, very smooth. It wasn't over-enhancing anything, it was just letting me see more or hear more of what was going on. I found the strings in this track were slightly fuller, but also slightly more textured from the Taijitu, and the vocal had a bit more air and a bit more richness. So it's almost a contradiction the way this cable worked compared to the stock Meze cable, is that it just brought out more detail without actually enhancing anything. It just, as I said before, gave me more insight. I also felt like the cymbals were kind of more refined, but with no loss of energy from them. And so generally speaking, everything was just a bit more relaxed, but nothing was smothered. It was relaxed, but very easy to access, very easy to listen to. And so at this point, I was thinking that the $900 price tag might have been a good choice. I don't mind spending a lot on a cable if it's the real deal and I'm using it with a super flagship headphone like the Elites. And so far, the Taijitu was impressing as an upgrade from the stock cable. But because I've got all these other cables here, I started through trying some others to see what I would hear. And so the next cable I reached for, and I just got confused which one was which again, was the plain old copper, it's a copper litz cable from Gladiator, again the Caesar range. So remember, this was a $95 cable up against a $900 cable. This one's just a basic copper litz cable. It's going to be a high purity copper and copper litz, meaning that each individual strand has been insulated on its own. And so this really put the marketing claims from Koala to the test. We've got a cable here in the Koala Taijitu focusing on the geometry, the number of strands, and not worrying so much about purity, compared to a cable from Gladiator Cables, which was a high strand count, a litz cable where each individual strand is insulated, but where the focus is on the quality of the wire, not the geometry so much, although litz in itself is its own geometry. And what I found when I then compared from the Taijitu across to the copper litz cable, what I found was that the tonality stayed the same, but I was getting more detail from the copper litz cable from Gladiator. And basically everything was just more articulated. There was more clarity, more crispness, but no enhancement of anything, no changes of tonality as I said before. The vocal was still rich, but had more texture and air than the Taijitu. With the cymbals, I could now hear more of the texture of the brush hitting the cymbal. And so this was a more insightful experience again compared to the Taijitu, but as I said before, it didn't change the tonality. So it was like the stock cable to the Taijitu gave me a bit of insight, and then going from the Taijitu to the much cheaper Gladiator cable gave me more insight again. And overall, the end result of listening through the Gladiator Caesar cable, this is their plain copper cable, the experience of listening to this was basically just that everything was better separated in the mix, had a better sense of articulation and clarity, but beyond that, nothing was changed from the stock cable or the Taijitu, and I mean that in terms of tonality, the overall experience of listening. It was just that everything was better separated and more clear, more easy to listen to, hear the details, etc. And so at this point, what it really showed me was that I think unfortunately the Koala cable has been built up on a marketing concept that maybe doesn't translate to the actual listening experience. For me, having listened to the two, I can't see any reason why you'd spend $900 on this when you can get the Gladiator cable, the Gladiator Caesar copper cable, for just $95. The Taijitu cable is clearly the nicer looking and feeling cable. It's not quite as supple, but it just looks and feels fantastic. But sonically, it's just a no contest with the Gladiator cable. And I should make it really clear here, I've got no allegiance in either direction here. I respect what Antonio's doing, but I can also see the flaws in some of the work he's doing as well. I also have no skin in the game. There's no financial kickbacks or incentives for me to like either of these cables. This is coming down purely to what I've enjoyed listening to. And the plain copper cable from Gladiator is just a clear preference for me compared to the Taijitu. Unless you want a kind of deliberately smoother, more refined cable, and I'm kind of bordering when I'm saying refined into almost smoothing off details sometimes when compared to what you can hear from the copper litz cable. If that's what you need for your headphones, then the Taijitu could be great, but I just don't really see why you'd spend $900 on it. And I apologise to Kevin from Koala Cables for saying that, but that's just my honest experience using these cables. The Taijitu just doesn't stack up financially for me. But so far we're only talking about with the Meze Elites, so maybe when we get to something like the Vérité Open, it might be a different story. They're very different driver types, they're very different styles of headphones, so let's hold off any final judgment on the Taijitu until we get to the Vérités, because it might change the story. Before we get to the Vérités though, let me finish off telling you about the other Gladiator cables on the Meze Elites. Moving from what I was really enjoying in the copper litz cable over to the hybrid cable, so that's the copper and silver hybrid. So what I understand there is that the copper and the silver are either combined as a single alloy, or it's some copper and some silver strands within the litz. And specifically why I'm clarifying that is it's not a silver plated copper. There is pure copper and pure silver in there, and they're combined in a way to make the overall wire. My specific understanding is that it is an alloy, so it's copper and silver that's been melded together through an alloy process. And so listening to the copper-silver alloy, what I was hearing was a sound that was very similar to the copper cable, but just a bit more articulated. It just kind of gives a little bit of extra energy to the leading edges of notes. It maybe brings just a tiny bit of extra treble energy, but hard to say. And I felt like it separated the sounds more. Sometimes perhaps a little bit artificially, but in a way that I found quite enjoyable. The only area that it maybe wasn't so good, and this was specifically thinking about it last with Joni Mitchell again, as I listened to that vocal in that one, it was like it stripped a little bit of the body out of the vocals and focused more on the air in the vocals. Not to an extreme extent, but in comparison to the plain copper cable, where I felt the balance was excellent between body and air in the vocals, I felt like maybe the copper-silver alloy just lent a little bit too much into the air. Again, this is talking about it with the Meze Elites, and as I'll talk about at the end, what I've found was that each of these cables is actually preferable with a certain type of headphone. And so stick with me till the end and I'll give you a sense of exactly which of these cables works best for which sort of headphone. But for now, when we're talking about the Meze Elite, for me the copper litz was still the winner. So far this is good news. The cheapest cable in the lineup is the one that's winning. But we're not quite finished because we need to talk about the pure silver litz. So the pure silver litz, as my description would suggest, is made of pure silver wires, again in that litz structure, so each strand is wrapped in its own insulation. But in all other ways, it's the same setup as the copper and the silver copper alloy. With the pure silver Caesar cable, I was hearing a wonderful sense of clarity from the Meze Elites. And for some reason, what I noticed was that going to the silver returned sort of the body of the sound back into its place. So where I said the copper silver litz started to strip out a little bit of the body and over enhance the air in the mix, I felt like when I went to the pure silver, it balanced it out. I was still getting an excellent sense of detail and clarity and air in the vocals, but the body was also there again. The silver cable is a little bit brighter than the copper, but it's in a very pleasant way. It's not stripping out any of the body, the bass, anything that I would want in the mix. It's just improving on the copper and giving me a greater sense of clarity and extension in the treble without pushing anything too far. And what I'm putting all that down to is that I think when we start to get into the alloys, you're getting a cable that's going to transmit the signal in different ways because of the different combination of metals within the wire. When we've got pure copper or pure silver, the signal is travelling through exactly the same medium from the moment it leaves your source device all the way through to the headphone. Whereas I wonder in the case of the alloy if, and I don't know what the internal structures of the alloys would look like, but I wonder if as it travels through the alloy, the different parts of the signal might be being affected. So things like higher frequencies might be travelling a little bit faster in some parts than the lower frequencies, and that could alter the way we perceive the end result of the sound reaching our ears. It's just a theory. I don't know if that's actually the case, but it's the only way I can sort of reconcile what I'm hearing in terms of the difference. It's not like I've gone from copper being the warmest to the alloy being somewhere in the middle and then the silver being the brightest. It's almost like I've gone from the copper being the slightly warmer cable to the alloy having a sort of mixed bag and splitting up the frequencies a little bit, and then coming back to sort of a halfway point where the silver returns the balance to the signal again, but is a little bit brighter than the copper. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, it might sound like I'm now saying that the hybrid cable isn't worth considering, and that's absolutely not the case. It's just that on the Meze Elite, I definitely prefer the copper and the pure silver, and less so the alloy. One other test that I was interested to try was to put the very expensive Meze upgrade cable here, and this is a silver plated copper. I was curious to put this up against the pure silver cable from Gladiator, and I was actually shocked to find that I was preferring this just a little bit less than the pure silver cable from Gladiator. The reason for that was I felt that somewhere in the mid-range, things weren't quite as cleanly defined from the Meze upgrade cable as they were from the pure silver. And I'm going to put that down again to this mix of metals. So we've got a silver plated copper in the Meze upgrade cable compared to the purity of just silver in the Gladiator cable. And I'm thinking that that might be messing with how the different frequencies are getting to our ears and just smearing or muddying the sound ever so slightly. We're talking very subtle shifts here, but it's all worth considering if you're going to start playing with cables. And so at this point, I'm incredibly impressed with the Gladiator cables for the Meze Elites. I could very happily use the copper cable, but my personal preference, as you can probably tell from what's already connected, is the silver cable from Gladiator Cables. For $180, it's a wonderful upgrade to a flagship headphone like the Elites. I'm expecting to be equally as good on something like the Empyreans. It's just a lovely all-round cable. But what if you've got a different headphone? Let's spend a little bit of time now talking about how these cables compare with something like the Vérité Open, which is a dynamic driver, it's high impedance, it's a very different type of sound, it's very fast, it's a little bit punchy. And then I also want to look at the Sendy Peacock, because that's got a very different tuning with a quite mid-forward sound. So let's start with the Vérité Opens. For my testing with the Opens, I went through a couple of tracks, but one that I made notes on was given up by the darkness. And starting with the stock ZMF cable and moving through the other cables, what I found was much like what I experienced with the Mezes when it came to the Taijitu. And that is that going from the stock cable to the Taijitu, everything stayed pretty smooth, pretty consistent tonally, but I was getting more insight into the sound. So if you just want that mild upgrade of what you're already hearing, you just want a bit more transparency, then the Taijitu is great. And ergonomically, it's also great. I also felt like the Taijitu was giving me a better sense of bass in the sound, just a slightly fuller bass. It wasn't like it was boosting the bass or anything like that, it was just like it made it more available. And so as I said, if you want to keep the original sound that you've got from your headphones, but you just want a little bit more transparency, a touch more resolution, then I think that's where the Taijitu could be a good choice. When I went to the copper litz cable from Gladiator though, all of a sudden it was the same story again as with the Meze Elites. I was getting the same tonal qualities as I did from the Taijitu and the stock, but more detail and more resolution. So unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, the Taijitu cable for me is just not worth the money. It's an overpriced cable built on good intentions and an interesting design approach by focusing on the thicker, larger conductors. But I do think the purity of copper is important. I think if this was made with a high purity copper and otherwise the same geometries, it could have been a really special cable. But as it is, I think it is overpriced, and I don't think it's performing on the level of other cables that I've tried, and other cables that are cheaper. And that's where the price issue comes in for me. I'm not seeing the value. I'm not seeing where you're spending the money here, given that it's a lower purity copper and you're not getting any particular parts that are significantly better than anything else, other than maybe the Via Blue splitter and the lovely sheathing. And I'm not going to pay $900 for that kind of cosmetic upgrade. As I moved on testing the other Caesar cables from Gladiator, what I found was that moving over to the copper alloy on the Vérité Opens was a really nice combo. As I said before, I didn't like the alloy so much on the Elite because of how it adjusted the sound and kind of pulled a little bit of the body out of the sound. But somehow when paired up with the Vérité Open, it was fantastic for that. And what I specifically found it did was help to focus and define the mid-range really nicely on the Vérité Opens. It was a lovely, lovely pairing. Moving on to the silvers, and now it was actually getting a bit too bright with the silver cable for me. And so this was a really interesting experiment. What this showed me was that choosing your cable depends a bit on the tuning and the driver type of your headphone. And so for me, if I was looking for a cable to suit the Vérité Open, then something like a copper-silver alloy litz is a fantastic choice, and obviously specifically I can say that the Caesar cable from Gladiator is a wonderful combo with the Vérité Open. At the moment I don't have any other ZMFs here, so if you're wondering how it goes with the Atriums or maybe with the Vérité closed, I can't answer that. I'm assuming it's going to be a good pairing with those as well, but I'm yet to try it. What I hope you're taking away from this though, is that you need to think about what the character is that you're looking for when you're tweaking with cables. I've discussed before, and it's worth mentioning again here, that cables are a very subtle upgrade. And they actually can be a downgrade too, but the point is they're a very subtle change. These are a 1%, 0.5% type shift, but it can be just enough to give you that little tiny bit that was missing from a headphone that you otherwise love. And so in the case of the Vérité Opens, I absolutely think the copper-silver alloy cable is a nice upgrade, but I'd also happily take the plain copper litz as well. And so with that in mind, I've got one more headphone I tried, and that was the Sendy Peacock, because as I said before, it's got quite a distinct tuning. It's quite mid-forward, it's not the most spacious or expansive sounding headphone, but it's got a lovely sense of focus on the mid-range because of its tuning. And so I was really interested to see what these different cables would do when paired up with the Peacock. Now it is worth mentioning I had to use little adapters that were made for the Peacocks to go from the Mini XLR into the high-res connector. And as I played around with all of these cables I've got here, not the Meze cables, but the Koala Taijitu and the 3 Gladiator cables, as I played with those on the Sendy Peacocks using When My Heart Beats Like a Hammer by B.B. King and Eric Clapton, what I found was that with the Peacocks, I kept coming back to the plain copper cables being preferable. And so on this occasion, it was the Taijitu cable and the copper litz cable that I preferred over the others. And what I specifically found was that the tuning of the Peacocks wasn't benefiting from any extra energy or emphasis going to the upper mids and treble. And so I think something like the copper silver alloy maybe emphasizes the upper mids a little bit, and I think the silver cable maybe emphasizes the treble a little bit more. And so between the two of them, whichever one I used, being the copper silver alloy or the pure silver cable, both of them just threw off the tonality of the Peacocks just enough that I enjoyed them less. None of them were bad. And so at this point, it's worth mentioning, if you're sitting here now going, I'm so confused, I don't know which cable to buy, how do I know what's going to suit my headphone? None of these were bad. It wasn't like any cable I connected and thought, oh, that's destroyed the headphone. What I'm pointing out here is that some of these cables provide some benefits over and above others, but they're all an upgrade over the stock cables based on what I've tried. And so for me, with the Sendy Peacock, the Caesar cable, the copper Caesar cable, was still my preference over and above the Taijitu. There's really no situation where I've tried the Taijitu and haven't felt like one of the Caesar cables was better. So again, I don't think it's worth spending the money on the Koala cable. I'm sorry to Kevin from Koala for saying that again, but it's just the reality, it's not stacking up. And so to bring all this to a close, the one other headphone I want to mention is that I also tried the Caesar cables, and I think I might have tried the Koala cable as well, with the Dan Clark Audio Expanse while I had it here. And that was really interesting, and I found myself with the Dan Clark Audios, or with the Expanse specifically, I found myself preferring again that copper silver alloy. It brought a sense of kind of articulation and focus into the sound from those that really helped to improve my perception of them. They're a headphone that I've got somewhat mixed feelings on. I love their tonality. I don't entirely like their sense of space and separation at times. And so I think what was going on was the copper silver alloy cable helped to give them that greater sense of space and separation, whilst keeping the tonality largely intact. And so maybe that's a good place to kind of wrap this up, is to talk about what I think each of these cables can do for you. Generally speaking, a pure copper cable is going to give you a smoother sound. It's going to maintain the tonality of most stock cables, unless it's come with a silver-plated copper cable, in which case that could be a bit different. But for many of the headphones that come with just a regular stranded copper cable, a pure copper or a pure copper litz cable is going to maintain that, but often give you an upgrade in terms of resolution and detail. When we go to silver-plated cables, or in the case of the Caesar cable, we're going to an alloy of silver and copper combined, what it's often going to do is kind of separate things out a bit more, start to articulate sounds a bit more, and maybe give you some extra separation in the sound if that's what you need. So if you do have a headphone where you feel like all the sound could do with a bit of separation, kind of exploding it apart a little bit, then I think that's where it is worth looking at something like a copper silver alloy, and therefore something like the Caesar cable. And finally, if you generally enjoy your headphone, maybe you want just a tiny bit more air, but otherwise keep it pretty much intact, then that to me is where the pure silver cables come into play. It can bring a little bit of extra life, a bit of extra energy to the treble, without skimming things too far, assuming you're still buying one with high quality silver. And that's probably the one final tip I'll leave you with. In my experience, and this goes directly against what Koala are saying in their marketing, in my experience, having a cable with the highest purity is more important than the metal. I've tried largely equivalent cables where one was, say, a 7N copper and the other one was like a 4N silver or a 5N silver, and what I've consistently found was the purity of the metal is the one that I tend to prefer. What's nice here is it seems that the purity of the silver in the Gladiator Caesar cable, the silver Caesar cable, is actually on par with something like the copper in the pure copper litz cable. And so if you're in a position where you've got all three cables of high quality wire and it just comes down to the metal, that's when you can think about what I just said about copper keeping consistent tonality, an alloy of some sort starting to split the sound apart more, and a silver cable bringing a little bit more brightness to the sound. And so hopefully I haven't just exploded your brain with too many alternatives. Hopefully I've painted a good picture of what you can get if you want to play with some of these cables. And my strong recommendations at the end of all this is unfortunately to steer clear of the Taijitu cable. I think you can spend your money much better elsewhere. but I am going to recommend the Gladiator Caesar cables so long as you're happy buying from a one-man band in a startup type situation. You're not guaranteed the same quality control or timeliness of delivery that you're going to get with a really established company like say Norn, DHC, Toxic Cables. There are so many out there making cables that have been around for a lot longer and they've got their systems in place. That doesn't mean that Antonio's work is shoddy from Gladiator, but it is going to be a little bit more prone to errors. And so if you're happy with that and you want to score yourself an absolute bargain on some amazing cables, then now's a great time to jump in and buy. Most cable companies start off selling cheap while they're setting themselves up, and then as their systems improve and they're starting to carry more stock, they're starting to turn over more products, that's when the prices start to go up. So you've got a choice to make there. If you're happy with what I've described about the potential challenges, then go ahead and get yourself a Gladiator cable. Again, this is the Caesar range. And if you're not okay buying from a small company like this, then you probably should think about what I've said here in terms of general advice around copper, silver, alloys, etc., and go and look at some of the more established companies, but be prepared to spend a fair bit more. And so I hope you found this review useful. It's ended up probably a lot longer than I expected it to be, and so hopefully there's been lots of good information along the way, and you've stuck with me because it's been valuable. If you have stuck with me to this point, thank you so much. And if you've done it because you enjoyed the video and or found it useful, I'd love it if you hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.